Okay, I want to welcome you to Design at Large for the spring quarter. I'm Jim Holland, and Haijun and I are sort of coordinating this time. Sitting next to Haijun is Brian. If you have any problems, with anything, you go to Brian. So if you're taking this course for credit, you need to fill out a thing online. It's bit.ly/design at large, where at is actually the word at, And but if you have problems, Brian will fix it. Okay, so I have about a 3-hour introduction for James because I've known him for a long time. But I want to start with just saying a little bit about the focus of the seminar this quarter. The sort of theme is AI and the new information age. And there was a recent article called Managing AI, Managing AI Risks in the Era of Rapid Progress by Jeff Hinton and a bunch of his colleagues. And it says, the beginning of the article is, in 2019, GPT-2 could not reliably count to 10. Only 5 years later, deep learning systems can write software, generate photorealistic scenes on demand, advise on intellectual topics, and combine language and image processing to steer robots. As AI developers scale these systems, unforeseen abilities and behaviors emerge spontaneously without explicit programming. Progress in AI has been swift and to many surprising. Jeff Hinton's a Turing Award winner. He's known as the father of deep learning, and sometimes he's called the godfather of AI. Jeff was a postdoc here at UCSD in our lab in the early days. Recently, Jeff sent me an email asking if I would have ever guessed that before we died, AI would be almost as smart as us. As I told Jeff, I certainly wouldn't have until recently. So I'm surprised and excited by the current AI advances, but also deeply concerned. We're clearly on the threshold of what I think is a new age of information. Today, I'm delighted to introduce James Landay, and I can't think of almost anyone who would be better to begin this seminar series on AI and the new information age. James is a professor of computer science at Stanford. He's a co-founder and co-director of the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI. And I have known James since he was a graduate student at CMU. In introductions, I always try to include some things that may surprise and maybe embarrass the speaker that I know about them. And I'm excluding a lot of things now. I went out to my sources. But for example, James met his wife, Eileen, in a hot tub and proposed to her just after he completed a marathon. He has renovated his backyard to add a hot tub. He is old enough that his first research video was in black and white. It was about silk. James is known for these acronyms for systems. And silk stands for sketching interfaces like crazy, with crazy also spelled with a K. I could go on, but I won't. James has moved around much more than the typical academic. He has been faculty at more top computer science department than anyone else I know. His first faculty position was at Berkeley. He then spent a decade at UW, where he was also director of Intel Labs Seattle. He has spent time at Microsoft Research in Beijing. I actually visited James in Beijing and gave a talk there. And it just so happened that the day I was giving the talk, Bill Gates was visiting Beijing MSR for the second time. And there was all kinds of security and things going on. And I thought, like, no one's going to come to my talk. But fortunately, they did. I don't think I overlapped with Gates. James then moved to Cornell Tech, and now he's at Stanford. During his moves, I was often asked by departments to write letters about James. I told him after he moved to Stanford that that was my last letter. So I think he's stuck on the farm now at Stanford, as it's known. James was recently honored by the ACM Sig Chi Lifetime Research Award. I don't know if he feels like I did when I got this award, but for me, it was a feeling of being first extremely honored and mixed with a feeling that I thought it was a little too early. And at least I hoped it was a little too early. James' talk today is on a critically important topic. AI for good isn't good enough, a call for human-centered AI. And so, James Landay.
Fine intro. It's an honor to be here with lots of folks like Jim that tell you my grad students regularly talk about one of the as a motivation for work. Others biggest compliment. So, I'm honored to, glad to be down in Southern California. What I'm going to talk about is AI. Okay, so AI is a powerful tool. You all know this. But I'm going to argue that it's critical that we design AI systems at what I term the user, the community, and the society level. And if you just want to start on this, if you simply start designing your AI systems beyond your direct user community, I think you'll be able to build systems that will have a more positive social impact. And so I've been developing this different way of thinking about design for AI systems over the last couple of years, and I'm going to try to use that as the basis to explain why I think we need to have a more, what I term, human-centered view of artificial intelligence. So as you all know, AI is taking the world by storm, whether it's scientific discovery with systems like AlphaFold that are going to change how diseases are attacked at great medical research places like here at UCSD, or NLP, where everyone at this point, I think, feels comfortable that they can speak into their phone and have it translated into pretty good language that works well. Or you're looking at some site and looking at reviews and you see a review in a foreign language and you have no qualms that you could say translate and it gives you a pretty good idea of what the person is saying. Or you could translate a document. Or even in fashion design, where people are using AI to determine what are going to be the styles coming up in the next season so that they have a better chance of not designing the wrong garments that might go into landfill, or just optimizing the supply chain that's required. We're seeing in all these different areas. This has been a build up really since 2014 as deep learning had started in research in the academia to show that it could do better than traditional AI algorithms and actually accomplish some of these real world tasks. We started to see companies putting really into product 2016, 2017. The rest of the public, though, just kind of woke up to this, which has been going on for 10 years, but we saw this great moment with ChatGPT. And I would claim it wasn't necessarily just what it could do. It was also the interface that people could interact with this and see for themselves. A lot of AI has already been happening under the hood. So whether it's ChatGPT to ask it a question, or maybe, the big difference between GPT-2 is I tried to write recommendation letters, couldn't do it. Now I think it probably could, right? The difference is there, right? I wrote 17 2 weeks ago. I didn't use it, but I should have. To Midjourney, to take a query like this that says, create an image like Ben Stearns' fashion photo shoot with decaying peonies, or to use Copilot or many other copilots to help you program or use your office tools. But I would claim this has been going on already even before this moment, that AI has been in our everyday lives, whether it's manipulating what we see in social network feeds and sometimes causing people, especially young women, let's say on Instagram, to feel bad about themselves, or deceiving people about what's true or not and causing them to be outraged, upending democracy at home and abroad, or even causing bias in programs that are being used for determining bail or sentencing, like we've seen here with the Compass program that was shown to be biased against Black Americans. We're seeing this also happening now in business. For example, AI-based chatbots hallucinating incorrect information that causes a business, in this case, Air Canada, reputational harm. So this technology is going to happen in all of our lives, from education to healthcare to public engagement. And it's really important because of that, that we think about what's the better way for us to design this technology to be good for society and people. So at Stanford, we founded this institute, the Institute for Human-Centered AI, just 5 years ago, last month, March. The planning started 2 years before that, and universities aren't so fast sometimes at actually getting stuff off the ground. So I would wished we did it 7 years ago, but 5 years ago. And we founded it because we saw this technology starting to work, and we saw from inside some of the biggest companies that it was starting to go into products that everybody is using every day. And we felt, if this is going to be so ubiquitous through society, we need to make sure we have an institute in an unbiased place like academia, but with the breadth of what universities bring, from the technologists, but the humanists, the social scientists, the legal experts, the medical experts, all coming together to help shape what this technology would be like. And we had 3 guiding principles that still guide a lot of the work we do, a lot of the work we fund at Stanford. So first, we believe AI should be guided by concern for its impact on human society. This technology is too potent to consider its impact and its effects after the fact, compelling us to really explore ethical implications before, during, and after its development. Next is, what's the future of intelligence and algorithms? We've gotten really far with deep learning. It's led to these Turing Awards. It's led to all the action you're seeing, all the products. But we don't see that as the be-all, end-all for intelligent systems. And so we believe that the human mind is still the most complex device in the known universe, and we should be inspired by the human brain as well as human social and cognitive behaviors to inspire future AI algorithms. And so some of the research at Stanford we fund and encourages in the neurosciences and cognitive and social sciences as well, because we think that's where ideas will come from. And we also think AI is a tool to also help push forward the learning about the brain and about other things about humans. And the one that I think is most relevant to me as a human-computer interaction person and a designer is the idea that AI should augment, not replace, human capabilities. So it's inevitable that AI will reshape significant swaths of the global workforce, and we should prepare ourselves for upheaval that may come in this coming few years or generation. We also believe, though, with the proper guidance, we can use AI to enhance the qualities that make us human. And in fact, we should think as designers from that mindset. And I'll try to make that argument as I go along on why we should think about augmenting humans is actually the right way to think about AI. So intelligence augmentation may be the term from many years ago that we should bring back. Now, because of some of the negative social impacts of AI and some of the positives that I've outlined, we've seen a slew of AI for good institutes or initiatives happening over the last few years. You could say HAI was one of the early ones of these. I don't even know if we're first, probably not. But I would say they mainly go in 2 different ways that leads them to be less effective than they could. So in one case, they are often made up of mainly social scientists who will be able to recognize current harm or maybe potential harm of AI systems and raise a warning about that. For example, with the Compass system. And that's good and useful, but it doesn't help us as those creating or designing this technology to figure out how to do it right, how to apply it in positive ways. How can we proactively design to avoid those issues? And the second type of AI effort, which is both more common and often fails, is when technologists try to go it alone. And we've seen a lot of that. So typically AI experts will see an important social impact area like health or education, and apply AI naively so that it doesn't actually work in practice. And this has happened repeatedly. It occurred acutely in short-term crises like COVID, but it's also occurred repeatedly over the long term. So for example, in 2016, Turing Award winner Jeff Hinton, who we just heard about, again, he won the Turing Award for deep learning, inventing much of this. He said, we should stop training radiologists now, as AI will easily surpass humans within 5 years. That's not worked out. Not in AI in radiology, not in AI in skin cancer detection, not in AI in several other areas, often due to differences between the ideal data sets on which researchers train and test their algorithms and the messiness of the data and the workflows found in real-world hospitals and clinics. That's not to say that these algorithms actually won't surpass humans on certain narrow tasks that we could test it on. In fact, I think we're already starting to see that. But I think what it shows is a lot of technologists thinking about these problems incorrectly and solving the wrong problem. And that's a bigger issue in terms of how we should think about creating these systems. So for example, instead of trying to replace radiologists, we might want to have AI systems working in tandem with the radiologists to make the technology more useful, augment the radiologist's capabilities rather than replace them. My Stanford radiology and AI colleague, Kurt Langlotz, writes in one of his papers, which got a little popular press in the New York Times, he said, will AI replace radiologists is the wrong question. Instead, he wrote, the right answer is radiologists who use AI will replace radiologists who don't. So think about that sentence. I think you could take the exact same form of that and apply it to many other jobs. And that's how we should think as designers about what we might want to do to make AI useful for people, maybe make them better at their jobs, enjoy their jobs better, take away the parts that maybe are tedious or that are boring. Now, the problem is I don't think we know how to design AI systems to have positive human impacts. And so I believe there is this better way to design AI for positive human impact, and that's what I'm going to talk about. So this better way is what I term human-centered AI. How do we get these positive outcomes from AI? That is, what would it have taken to have avoided the negative outcomes from that Compass AI-assisted sentencing? Now, to avoid these outcomes, we need to design and analyze at 3 levels in conjunction, as I mentioned at the beginning, in terms of the user, the community, and society. And I believe if you'll do this, you create technology that has a better chance of making positive impact. So what do I mean by this human-centered AI and this 3 levels of analysis? So first, human-centered AI is about the scope of who we study. So who we study to help us find our problems, develop our solutions, and then evaluate whether we've done the right thing. Okay, so who do we involve? So to do this, I think we first need to have a user-centered or a human-centered process. That is to integrate well-known techniques from human-computer interaction and design, many of which were developed right here at UCSD in cognitive science, but in the broader design and human-computer interaction community over the last 30 or 40 years, which took 20 or 30 years for industry to finally accept as normal and needed practice, right? We've been there somewhere between 10 and 20 years, depending on who you're talking to. So we need to start with that, where we design and account for the needs and abilities of end users of our systems early and often, and rapidly iterate and improve a design with rigorous testing. That will help us develop those AI systems that will work for our intended users rather than futilely trying to replicate humans. But I'll argue that's not enough. As has been illustrated by some of the harmful examples I mentioned previously, you can't only design around the user. That would be like designing that sentencing system for Compass just for the judge, creating a nice user interface so they could understand or at least think they understood the data. But that would ignore some of the underlying systemic issues. It would ignore the community that system and the decisions that come out of it impacts. So the people who are accused, their families, their lawyers, if there's a victim involved in the crime, those folks and their families as well. We need to understand the issues from the different communities these people come from and the structural barriers they might face. For example, racism, before we could appropriately design that sentencing system. What's interesting is maybe some of those people that we meet when we have this broader view of who we're interviewing, who we're observing, who we're engaging to do design might become users that we would want to engage in that original part of our user-centered design process. So it's widening our scope of who we're considering. I'd claim even that's not enough, because we might also need, in this Compass case, to understand what the impacts are on society at large. If a system that you're building is successful and becomes more ubiquitous and used throughout society, it could have negative societal consequences. So as designers, we may want to see if we could predict and mediate potentially some of those issues. So in this case, what does it mean to have a large percentage of Black males in prison in the US? Or a large percentage of people who are caught using illegal drugs? These are issues that have immense societal costs. And we want to be able to forecast, as I said, if these become ubiquitous and try to mediate them. Now, you're all really smart people at UCSD. At this point, you should be saying to yourself, okay, that's good, but that sounds super hard. And I think it is really hard. That doesn't mean we shouldn't necessarily think about how to do it, but it's especially hard for technologists who are not trained to think about analyzing in this way. And so that's why for these systems, we really need to think about having different types of teams attacking these problems. They need to be interdisciplinary teams. Yes, we need AI experts and technologists. We also need designers. We also need social scientists. And we may need design experts in, I should say, domain experts in particular areas that you're designing for, whether it's in health or law or environmental science. And those folks need to be members of these teams from the start. You can't simply bring them in at the end or have a different group that has that expertise and say, hey, we're ready to release this product. Let us know. Is it going to do any harm? By then, it's too late. We've already seen this repeatedly with social networks and companies like Meta, Facebook, that those folks were there. They would lose every time. So these people actually have to be on teams from the start when they can have actually impact through the social relations that you have with your teammates to have impact on what you build and go on with. So what I'm gonna do is recap a little bit of what I'm claiming here. So the model is human-centered AI requires that we have an interdisciplinary team analyze this problem at these three levels of user, community, and society simultaneously, or at least close in time. And what's interesting, as I mentioned in the community level, there will probably be people, concepts, and findings that will inform these other levels of analysis. So there's some interdependencies between these. So I want to run you through what this type of analysis might look like for two examples beyond sentencing. The first is from the literature and popular press, and the second from one of my own research projects, where I will use this analysis to show how we went wrong and also how I think we're doing better today. So this is a Tesla car. How many people in San Diego, I think I'm going to get a good answer. How many people drive a car? Okay, good number. I gave this talk in London a few months ago, and out of 40 people, there were like 3 people. So I had to kind of explain these 4 wheels and all this stuff. Okay, so here's a Tesla car. Any Tesla drivers in the audience? Okay, we got a few. Okay, so I'm using the Tesla as just an example. Tesla has this autopilot mode or a software full self-driving, but a lot of people have been working on autonomous cars. And we can argue on whether autonomous cars will happen or not. If you're Elon Musk, you'll say it's already happened years ago. And if you're, let's say Toyota or legacy car companies, you might say, oh, it's 10 years away or maybe 20 or maybe never. It all depends on what you consider autonomy in all situations, all weather, all places that have been mapped or not. And we can argue it's happened or not. One thing you should know, most of you are kind of young and you might go, oh, this has been happening for 5 or 10 years. I've been reading about it. This is an area of research that's been going on 40 or 50 years. You know, back in the day, Jim said he knew me when I was a grad student in the early 90s at Carnegie Mellon. There was a truck that drove on the public streets through the park there, Shenley Park. It only went maybe 10 miles per hour, and it had like 20 Sun Microsystems workstations in the back. You don't know what the hell Sun is. They made these big workstation computers. That was autonomous driving. So people have been working on it for a long time. And one flaw, I think, is almost all of the effort has been at this user-centered level, thinking, how do I replace a driver, and mainly focused on, well, what does the driver see? What does the driver do? And ignored a lot of these other levels of analysis that I actually think will affect how you think about this problem and may have changed what we might have done. So at the driver level, we might think about, well, from a user interface perspective, what do they see in the car? Maybe in the Tesla, this image behind the steering wheel showing them what it's sensing. Or maybe we might think about, how do we get the attention of the driver in case the system starts to be less confident in its inferences because of weather or mapping that it hasn't seen before, or somebody's just not behaving right on the road, whatever. That's where a lot of like driver level action might occur. But these other levels of analysis are quite important to solving or even posing this problem correctly. At the community level, we care about other drivers and their behavior, whether it's in autonomous cars or non-autonomous cars. So where I live, I don't know about down here, there's autonomous cars being tested all the time. Even on my street, I would see one of these on a regular basis. And guess what? What do you think other drivers do when they see one of these around them? They behave differently. They drive differently than they did if they saw another driver. That's something that I think if we thought about it from this higher level, we might have figured out in the lab, not just after we spent hundreds of millions or billions of dollars deploying and seeing, oh, we have to think about how to do this differently because of that. Similarly, we care about studying interactions with pedestrians and bicycles. I would claim these have been an afterthought for these efforts and actually led to many of the serious early problems that could have been avoided if they had been considered much earlier on in this consumption of autonomous driving. So one of the really famous first deaths was a person walking their bike across the street at night. These folks had thought about pedestrians. Yeah, we got pedestrians. And they thought about bicyclists. They didn't think about a person with a bike walking it. And unfortunately, this person lost their life due to this kind of short-sighted view of what the system would be. But finally, at the society level, we need to consider the impacts of autonomous cars on a city or region. Maybe the impacts are not as positive as the enthusiasts might lead you to believe. Some studies have shown that autonomous cars will lead to more traffic and more deaths due to driving more miles, living further away, and sending cars around empty. Now, deaths, I'm not sure about. If we get it really good, we might get less deaths, and it just depends. But the real key thing is to think about people driving more miles. And that might not be so obvious, but I live on the Stanford campus. It's around 35 to 40 miles south of San Francisco. If I'm going up to with my family to San Francisco to get dinner or go to a show or something like this, I'm not going to pay $50 or $60 to park my car downtown when I can just send it back home safe in my driveway. Or maybe I can send it 10 miles south to South San Francisco where somebody has a business of a secure garage for $10 for 24 hours, right? Or I live on the Stanford campus. It's really expensive, just like San Diego. Maybe it's not worth paying $3 million for a house, and I could live 2 hours to the east in the beautiful Central Valley. Anybody here from around the Central Valley? I could live there. I might need more AC for the heat, but I can sleep for 2 hours every morning as my car drives me to work. Or I can do PowerPoint slides because that's what faculty do anyways, all right? So it's gonna change the behavior of people and how they use cars in a key way. Now, these aren't just newspaper headlines, but are based on research, for example, by transportation experts at the University of Texas, who found, at least in the Texas Triangle mega region, which is Austin, Dallas, Houston, San Antonio. I'm always like, okay, I got three things. There's something on another line there on that triangle. They said autonomous cars will lead to traffic being swamped on their roads because of this extra amount of use of cars and the change in people's behaviors. So what's going to happen is we're going to have to spend billions or trillions of dollars building new road infrastructure account for this difference in behavior. Now, with that type of analysis from the start, we might decide that our societal resources might be better spent on building a better public transit system. For example, wow, right outside of your building, you got a train coming here. I got dropped off and I was like, this is cool right here. Very rare to see this in the United States. I've just come back from several trips overseas, and every time an American goes to Asia or they go to Europe, they're like, why can't we have this? Don't you? Right? We can't have it because we're not necessarily the ones in power making these decisions. And also we're not analyzing some of these things at that level. Instead, we're thinking about it at a really low level of what we might sell to the consumer. So if we only analyze and design at the user-centered level at the start, we might ignore these important questions until it's too late. And these are questions of power. Who has the power to choose what we do with our societal resources? And right now, I'd say that power is concentrated. It's concentrated in large corporations for things like autonomous cars. But now, as you're seeing foundation models or large language models having all of the impact in AI, it's concentrated in the companies that control those models. So you might think about that power and what it means for our society as well as other societies around the world who are going to have to use those systems. I don't want to give you the impression that there's no related work in this space. So I just wanted to show you a little bit. So the fields of HCI and design have been, as I said, working at this user-centered level for 50 years. And there's many known techniques. And there's great newer work applying these specifically to AI. For example, there was this good paper in Kai a few years ago by Salimi Amershi and colleagues at Microsoft Research and the University of Washington. Quite good if you haven't read it. At the community center level, we've had this well-known technique that could be useful here, value-sensitive design developed by Batya Friedman and David Hendry, which helps designers find and be explicit about the values of users rather than just the values of the designers. And there's new ideas such as design justice that has been coming around. And then finally, at the society-centered level, there's less well-known techniques, in my opinion, on how to design for this, but there is at least good recent work pointing out what some of the problems might be. For example, Safia Noble's book, Algorithms of Oppression. One of the key research questions for me is how do we integrate many of these ideas into a coherent design process, i.e. a design process that I could teach to undergraduates here at UCSD or at Stanford, and they could go and apply this in industry, or that I could teach to our industry partners so they could apply. So that's part of my research agenda right now, is trying to create such a coherent design process. Now I've given you an idea of what human-centered AI is. I want to take you through one of my own projects that uses AI and show you where it is human-centered, but also where we can do a lot better. And so that human-centered AI lens that I just presented you has really started to change this project for the better after what I would claim are early missteps, all my fault. So the motivation for our hybrid physical digital spaces project is that many Americans are overstressed, inactive, wasteful, uninspired, and feeling isolated in their work or home or school. Nobody here, right? Okay, none of you, but there are other people. And what was interesting to us is that we observed that people spend much of our time inside the built environment with these afflictions. Actually, 87% of our time in homes and offices, according to the US EPA, and maybe 5% of our time in our autonomous, or for some of us, non-autonomous cars, okay? And maybe we get another, 7 or 8% outside. So what we wanted to understand is how features of the built environment, such as materials, access to light or nature, as well as the user experience, either the noise level or dynamic digital displays on the walls, impact people's well-being. There's growing awareness that our time spent in buildings can negatively impact our wellness. But surprising to me was that the science behind this awareness and the recommended strategies to improve the situation are quite thin. This surprised me, as I said, when I started the project with my colleague, Sarah Billington, who's the chair of our Civil and Environmental Engineering department at Stanford and also had an architecture background in her early days at Princeton. We were surprised. And I thought, oh, the architects, they must know all this stuff, like what stuff you build with will change how you feel. And if not them, the civil engineers, they're more engineer sciencey, they should have done this. But as we looked through the literature, it is actually quite thin, which for some people is like, oh, that's such a shame. For researchers, that's usually like, oh, this is good. Nobody's done this. We have some interesting work to do. We're excited. So we based our initial ideas on a model that illustrates how building features, individual outcomes, organizational outcomes, and societal outcomes are linked. So by building features, we mean things like the design and construction, but also the user experience. For example, as I said, how noisy it is, or is there access to natural light, or what type of material was used, and is there access to nature? In fact, I'm loving this building because I'm seeing a lot of natural wood and light. I haven't seen too many plants yet, but we're doing well, okay? But if these features are negative, like I've shown here, they can lead to bad individual outcomes like stress, anxiety, and distraction. And that, I would say, is at the user-centered level. And these in turn lead to organizational or community outcomes such as a lack of productivity, waste, and a sense or lack of belonging. That's at the community-centered level. And finally, these community organizational outcomes have impact at the societal level, our economy, our environment, our health and well-being. And at least we were thinking about these three levels from the start. So this slide actually came from the original presentation for an internal Stanford competition maybe 5 or 6 years ago where we got the money to start this project. I've added those user, community, society things to the top because I hadn't even thought of design in this way at this time. But we were thinking about it at least. Now, in my research group, we often start out with a vision of what this future might be by creating a video. And you might think, oh, that's kind of crazy. You start with a video. Usually we build a thing and then we make a video. We actually start with a video. And part of the idea here is to work out some of our ideas, just trying to write the script for it and shooting it. And then we have something we can show people and get feedback and they can say, oh, that's really stupid. Why are you doing that? Before we've spent years actually building the thing. So here's a concept video that Stanford undergraduates made for me maybe 5 years ago. And there's some things in it that I think you'll see and you'll be like, that's stupid. Why would you build it? But that helped us know which things maybe we could do or will do before we went. But I just wanted to show you kind of where we start. So imagine this office in the future where digital ambient displays on the walls encourage people to get more exercise. We don't have professional actors. By taking the stairs while also saving the building energy. Or where we could personalize the temperature for different individuals so some are too cold and some are too hot. Or that we could actively cancel noise so that movement from an office space or disruption or where we can detect the stress of a workroom and adapt our space to have more natural security. Lower the lights and change the music to reduce the stress. As a designer, I'd say do it in a non-creepy way. Or imagine we can use digital art built into the windows to encourage people to meet others they haven't met before. or even to go outside. At least for those of us who live in this climate, we can't see the So this is a vision for the future. It's a vision where buildings and people interact in a way that positively shapes our well-being. I'll admit it's a very techno-optimist future. And so now I think what we were trying to do, based on what I told you about the related work, was take a more integrated and scientific approach that the prior research did not. So our first step was really, could we establish the science and understand how different building attributes impact occupant states in more naturalistic settings? But before we even get to that, we also wanted to understand what type of sensing and data collection people are willing to work with and which they'd prefer not to have. So I'm going to discuss these different issues in turn. So after some preliminary online experiments, we ran a year-long controlled lab experiment with over 400 people. And in this experiment, we systematically varied building features that you see here, such as natural or artificial materials. So you'll see natural wood materials up here versus that kind of white laminate stuff. We were able to vary natural versus artificial light. So we had these two identical offices down the hall from each other. We literally paid somebody to build a wall over the windows in one of them so that we could remove that in that condition. And we varied the images on the walls. You can't see too well here, but there's 3 large photos on the wall. And we varied the diversity of the individuals in those images. So in one condition, they are all white males, and in the other condition, there was a variety of gender as well as racial makeups. Now, one of the outcomes we were really interested in is how did these spaces affect people's stress? So we outfitted people with an Apple Watch as well as an Empatica armband so we could measure electrodermal activity, or EDA, which is often correlated with stress. But since this was a lab study, we actually had to stress them out. So we played with a variety of different techniques on how to stress people out. There's a lot of known techniques with people doing math while doing another task at the same time. We didn't find these worked as well. What we found worked really well is we also had a camera in the study. We said in the middle of it, we would say, by the way, now in 5 minutes, you're going to get to give a talk on your personality characteristics, positive and negative. And wow, that's really stresses people out quite well. So we tested a bunch of these before. That's the one that we looked at. So what were the results of this? I'm just going to show you some of the biggest results. You can look in the journal article there for more. But the one, it was surprising to me, the condition with the natural materials helped decrease the stress in participants. Here you see self-report where the natural material is green, lower is better, statistically significant. And we also saw this with the Empatica armband in terms of them getting to a lower stress level and also returning to the norm more quickly. Participants exposed to the windows and the natural light or scenery also had lower negative stress impacts, just not as big of an impact as we saw with the furniture. There's also other issues for diversity and creativity and other outcomes that you can see in the paper. Again, we saw effects, but smaller effect sizes. Now, in the long run, we wanted to be able to understand these in naturalistic settings over longer periods of time. So not just in a lab study for an hour. We've only done some pilots of this so far, but the idea is if we were able to get information about these different outcomes, and in particular, we are interested in these right here. So stress, belonging, creativity, physical activity, and environmental behavior. How could we get information on that without having you to fill out a bunch of standard psychological forms, which is really the prior work. All they ever did was you're in an office, you fill out a bunch of forms about your life there, and then maybe a month later you move to a new building and they a month later do that. That was the kind of research that had been done. So in our lab study, in some ways we replicate that in addition to the sensing. But what would we do if we were just seeing you in your office over weeks or months? And so we thought we could use a lot of the data that is out there that we have in buildings today. So for example, all newer buildings have a lot of building data, mainly for sustainability and security reasons, but they tell us a lot about who is there and how many people and when. They also tell us about water and light, energy use, and even trash and recycling. So that's one set of data. Another is self-report. So I may have just poo-pooed self-report a little bit as the way to do these studies, but we use a different kind. So we use ESM, or experience sampling method, where we might just ask you one question, like how stressed are you on a scale of 1 to 7, that you can answer quickly on a watch or phone. And we might ask you that 4 or 5 different times during the day. It doesn't cost people a lot of effort, but it has been shown to get very accurate data. And then finally, we take advantage of these personal devices, ones that people are wearing. I'd say my Ring too, but somehow I lost it. My phone, or even your laptop. One of my postdocs has been able to show, just by looking at your trackpad behavior, we can tell your stress. And we've done this in the car too. After 7 turns, we can tell somebody's in a stress condition. Okay, so we can take all this data and start to infer these things about people. Oh, I should mention, we try to stay away from productivity, because that is actually the one area that's been studied a little more, and it has a lot of really potentially negative outcomes for management misuse. So think about Amazon warehouse workers who may be fired if they don't pack enough boxes. So we didn't really want to go there. So we triangulate between these. That is the basic idea. We looked at privacy from the start, because that data that I just mentioned to you is really highly personal and sensitive. So it's important to have technical and non-technical approaches to privacy and security, make sure people are comfortable with the type of data. So we've done a lot of studies about this, making sure it's opt-in, making sure the data is secure. But as I started to think about this project at this point, I noticed that much of what we were doing is really only user-centered. There might be a tiny bit of community-centered design, for example, saying opt-in for people who come into the building, or, I want to make sure that, Jim meets the new grad student down the hall that he hasn't met yet. But mostly it was based on personal impact for the individual user or occupant of the building in terms of their health or their environmental activity. So it really felt something was missing. And how might we get at that community-centered and society-centered issues? And so now I'm going to show you some of our newer research as we finish here, where we've developed really a new workshop method that tries to get a better understanding of these higher levels. So let's think about the features that I've shown so far and what levels we're designing at. So at that user-centered level, we're mainly thinking about building occupants or the residents who would want the features for themselves, as I said, get more exercise or deal with their stress, and maybe keep their data private. At the community-centered level, not really much, maybe the meeting the new people, but that's about it. And then at the society-centered level, we weren't really thinking too much about it. Maybe it's the economy, maybe it's public health, like I had on that first slide about how we set up the project. But we really weren't thinking about the social impacts of the building like this. And I would blame myself as an HCI person who has been teaching and doing user-centered design for 30 years. That's what we think about. We're thinking, oh yeah, users, without thinking about some of these broader levels of issues that I think become more important in these kind of smart systems, AI systems that actually have impacts beyond your direct user, because they leak out in a lot of ways. So one of the big issues that we wanted to think about was, in a smart space, how do you communicate to individual users and the community about what's happening in the space? What data is being tracked and how is it being used? So this big part of our newer work has really focused on how to communicate these issues to people who use our hybrid physical digital spaces. So one way that products communicate these issues today is using privacy policies. But these privacy policies are useless. So at left here is an art piece where the artist has printed out real privacy policies from products that many people in this room probably use every day. Nobody reads them. How many of you read the privacy policies for products, and they say, accept it, say yes. Yeah, good. There's always 1 or 2 in the room, and that's great. But these are purely a legal construct. They're meant to protect the companies that write them from lawsuits. They aren't really meant to communicate to you as the user what's really going on with the product. So instead, we were looking for another way to communicate what's going on in the building. We've been developing this idea of what we call implication design. This is where we try to embed a product's ethical implications directly into its design. For example, this is an artist-produced effort here called the iCam, not from my group again. It's a webcam that is shaped like a creepy human eye. You really know it's watching you. And I'd say that's a form of communication. You know what's going on. It's not ambiguous. There's some examples of this in the market today. For example, many of us have our phones and maybe a little green LED goes on or on your monitor when you're recording. But I'd say those interventions don't quite communicate the extent of the threat. This is another artist-produced item. This is called the Parasite. You put it on your smart speaker, and it only unlocks when you give the keyword that you've defined. So you're sure that Google, Amazon, Apple, or Baidu are not listening in on your conversations. It protects you, and I'd say it also communicates somewhat if you see it. And we were trying to combine these ideas of communication, protection, and implication design. So this more concretely, this uneasiness with some of these privacy implications at the community and society level led us to develop and run several design workshops. And in these workshops, we have the participants pose benefits and risks and work through value trade-offs and then suggest potential interventions. We've now run the workshop with over 110 participants over 8 iterations. And so I want to give you an idea of what it looks like. So the key idea is that the participants are diverse in terms of domain knowledge. So we have technologists, designers, but also domain-specific experts, but they're also diverse in terms of their lived experience. So it's meant to be lightweight so that everyone can participate. And I'm not going to go into the details, but just know there's these 3 different rounds that are structured around creating and using a deck of cards. And in the anticipation round, the participants fill out the deck of cards by speculating on hypothetical situations, including the impacted users, as well as the positive and negative implications. You can only do negative if you want to really design. And then that's followed by an implication design round where participants prototype potential designs for communicating or mediating the implications of the anticipated threat. Finally, in the action round, the groups use the finished card deck and they play a role-playing game, which is actually cooperative, which is something we learned over doing this, that worked better, where they try to pose a potential threat and their paired team tries to use the design artifact to counter the threat. So in September was the last time we ran this. So this was, the 8th time. We applied this technique in a workshop with 13 older adults in San Francisco to explore new speech-based AI technologies for health. And we had 3 groups of participants, and they all had, the groups had intersectional identities. So these were folks who are marginalized in addition to age, because they were older adults. 50% approximately were LGBTQ, many had disabilities, and they were of different races. This just gives you a sampling of the over 50 implication design prototypes that they produced during the workshop. And I'm gonna walk you through a few in detail just to give you an idea of what they were doing. So we started with this technology scenario. Imagine having a device that can speak with you the same way humans can. It's been programmed by your doctor to ask questions related to your health and well-being. It learns as much as it can about you and provides that information to your doctor so they can adapt your care. It also makes recommendations personalized to your needs and serves as a companion, actively listening to anything you want to tell it. Now, we purposely embed things in there that we think will cause people to think there's some risks so that they can really trade off what the issues are. So here's one of the many implication designs produced at left. It shows different levels of what they called accessibility to their data, and I'll read what the person wrote. The main doctor could have some things on a screen. A nurse would also have some accessibility, and the other one would be like the security person in your building. They'd have a different level of interaction and family, and then friends and all your senior friends, junior club or whatever. But it would have a variable of security. Here's another one. This is a device you hang around your neck. If there's a problem, then you can press the button. So the blue button, if you're panicking, you can press the blue button and it will regulate your breathing. Relax, calm down. I could use that. Red, stop everything. Yellow, resume life. And I'll show you a third one. This was a detecting device in the doorway, so a caregiver that might be taking advantage can be caught. Doorway device detects how much money you have in case a caregiver steals money. So if a caregiver leaves with more money than they came with, it will stop them. Also detects chips on your credit card to see how many credit cards you entered and left with. Okay, so you should take these as not real designs, right? these are starting points for design. I wouldn't build any of those things, but they get at the problems that these older adults see in a different way than simply observation or interviews would get at. So they surface things that maybe other techniques wouldn't see. And that would be where your professional design team would then start to think about how do we embed that user need in the designs that we're going to come up with. So if I use my human-centered AI analysis at the 3 levels in this hybrid physical digital spaces case, it might look something like this. At the user-centered level, we work with and we design with building residents, the companies that lease the space, building managers, and building owners. At the community-centered level, we should work with anyone who might come into a building or even neighbors, the taco truck downstairs, whatever you have. And at the society-centered level, we need to analyze carefully how this system might impact many different groups, but in particular, people with disabilities or other marginalized identities that they do not wish to disclose to others. It also raises general questions of privilege in society. Who has access to these fancy health-shaping buildings and who does not? And what happens if these buildings are used for workplace surveillance? So far, we've mainly focused on these lower portions of those 3 levels of analysis. And the questions that I've raised are at that society level, or that I've raised at the society level of analysis, imply this analysis must analyze questions of power, again, which is often left out of technology research. If the decision makers decide to prioritize the user-centered design for managers over the community-centered design for the workers, surveillance state buildings is what will result, and we need a design to actively avoid this. So this recognition of power reminds me of a great talk that I saw almost 2 years ago by Ibram X. Kendi, the well-known author and MacArthur winner. He was visiting the Rhode Island School of Design, and President Crystal Williams of RISD asked Dr. Kendi, what can artists and designers do in creating an anti-racist society? And he said, what is missing is an analysis of power. We live in a moment when different identity groups are advocating for their rights, their power, their presence, and pushing back. What is missing are the bridges of solidarity. We need to constantly be building those bridges. Historically, you know who has built those bridges, artists and designers. So I believe as designers, we need to take on the analysis of design at the 3 levels I've advocated, the user, the community, and society, so we can properly identify and take on power, so we can build those bridges of solidarity. What I want you to take away from this introduction is there are many great applications where you can use AI to help people be better at their tasks, to augment them, to be better learners, better designers, or take better care of their body. I think you'll see a lot of those examples in the seminars that you have for the rest of the quarter, as well as just reading what's going on in the press. That's all about, hey, look what AI is going to do for you in a positive way. I'm not saying that won't happen. I think it will, but we also need to shape it properly so it has those positive impacts. And that key to doing this is to keep users, communities, and society's needs at the center of these smart interface designs. It's critical that we design at these 3 levels. We're really in the early days of this. A lot of people are like, oh, if you haven't implemented AI in your business next year, you're toast. This is going to be a 10 to 20 year build out, and we should be designing the techniques and the tools that are going to help businesses and designers and others do this better. And you right here at UCSD, I think, can start by designing with communities just beyond your direct user population, and you'll have a better probability of creating AI systems more likely to have a positive human impact. Thank you. We have like 5-7 minutes for questions. We have a mic somewhere. What's your question?
Good day. Would it be better to prepare for the day when artificial intelligence, automation, computers, and robotics replace work? Your thoughts. Thank you.
Replace what?
Work. The need to work. Thank you.
Well, I mean, I think that's good for people to work on, but I think a lot of people will actually not love the day where they don't have work to do that they find fulfilling. I think there's plenty of folks who are working on how I should pay you to not do work and enjoy leisure. I actually don't believe that computer AI and robotics is going to replace all of work for a very, very, very long time. And if we just look at the history of AI predictions of when these things will happen, we'll see that it's always been wrong. And so I think it's much more likely it's going to take pieces of work and shift it in different ways. And we've already have a history of that. You know, for example, automation has changed law. Anybody here thinking of going to law school, or anybody in law school? So it used to be first-year lawyers would spend all their day going through thousands of documents just looking for words for discovery. Guess what? That got automated away. I haven't met a lawyer yet who says I missed that day. So there's definitely a lot of pieces of jobs we might automate away. Whether we want to automate away all of jobs, one, I don't think it's going to happen, and it won't happen if it does for quite a long time. So yes, somebody should worry about that. But I think the idea of worrying about these things that are much more science fiction than the actual issues of AI today, like the harms of AI, which I call today the triple D. So discrimination and bias, disinformation, and deepfakes, that's happening now. We should work on those, not a sci-fi future that may or may not happen in 50 years. Yeah, up here.
Thank you. So I'm thinking back to the Tesla example you mentioned, and you talked about the use case that hadn't come up of the person walking the bicycle. So I was hoping you could speak a little bit more about how we as researchers and designers uncover the unknown unknowns, because a lot of times the biggest ahas I have found are in things like contextual inquiries, which we don't have a lot of time or budget to do.
Yeah, so the question is, how do you discover some of these unknowns? One is this idea of we don't have the budget, I think is maybe not the right way to look at things, because the companies say they don't have the budget. Similarly, they said they didn't have the budget to do user-centered design. But over time, we learned, no, it actually costs you a lot more to fix those issues after you've built a product rather than fixing it while you're sketching on the whiteboard or on a piece of paper. I think similarly for these issues, if we caught these issues when it was in the research lab or when somebody was doing it early on, way less costs out there. That's why I wanted to show that Air Canada example. Just a little chat bot probably cost them a lot of reputational costs. Imagine if it was something that, you know, for example, popped a door out of the plane and people got sucked out. That would have cost a lot more. Look at what Boeing's stock is worth today based on some of these things. I'm not saying that's an AI problem, but these things where bad things happen because you didn't do it right will cost way more than the investment of doing it right early on, okay? And I would claim this kind of methodology might even lead to a bigger market in addition to the reputational cost by looking at a broader set of people. So I think key is doing these things. And another one is the teams. So I think if you have these teams that have more diversity, whether it's diversity that we think of in the normal sense of ethnic and experience, but also these diversity of fields, you're actually more likely to uncover a lot of these problems. The classic example I like to think about is the gender shades problem, where they found that computer vision doing facial recognition totally was failing on Black women and other people of color. If that team in those companies had more diversity on it from the start, they would have found that while they were still working on it, and they would have fixed it. And those companies wouldn't have taken any reputational hit, which I think Amazon took the most of because they just kept denying it when they released it. So I think these techniques are going to save money for companies. And the keys are these kind of processes that take a broader view of things as well as a broader idea of who is on the team. Right now, these companies, these teams are really just technologists with maybe a little design sprinkled in. The social scientists sit over here in this other group, and they're asked to check these things when it's too late actually to have any impact. And I think that's what we really need to change. Yeah, back here.
Hi. So I'm really glad to hear that we're bringing questions of power into HCI into AI design specifically. I think a lot of the theories of power that seem to be at play here are kind of theories drawn from like race and ethnicity studies, gender studies, Foucault. But there's like also another form of power that deeply affects the ability for any of this analysis to be meaningful in industry, which is the power that those tech workers actually have. So Timnit Gebru, famously, a Stanford alum, like got fired from Google for talking about the environmental impacts of AI. We hear stories all the time from designers in the field who are like, like the company's only interested insofar as it can be bottom line adjusted, but some things are not going to be good for the bottom line. So I want to propose that the question of how to build power, how to align with organizations like unions that work to build power in society has to be part of this analysis, or this is all going to be like a different shape of just ethics, basically.
So that's a good question. First, I will say I'm not an expert on power. I don't come from sociology or political science or many of the other fields where the study of power is pretty common in it. But I would claim that an example like Timnit Gebru actually points at the structural organization of teams that doesn't work. She was on a team for responsible AI, separate from the team actually building the technology. Right. Fine. And I think those teams don't have power because they're not part of the development. And I've seen people who have been on those teams and said, yeah, we told them this thing would have the harmful impacts, for example, of Facebook. And when they see product A versus product B and A makes more money, A gets out. Same people said, oh, I've been embedded on the team with this expertise, and it had a different outcome because we were able to use our social connection as a team member to impact the type of work happening. Now, I don't have a ton of case studies yet to go, yeah, that's true, other than, people telling me this, but I think there is logic to why that will have more success than the trust and safety team that is just another checkbox that you have to pass through to get released. By that point, it's all about money, and money's going to win. It could still win at these earlier stages. Ethics could still have impact. I also think we need law, regulation, and other stuff to help, tell us what's good or bad for folks who still do the bad thing. We haven't actually seen a lot of negative legal consequences for a lot of these bad behaviors from Facebook, Meta, Google, et cetera. And so I think you need to hit it in 3 different ways. So one is the process and team. Another one is what you mentioned a little bit, not necessarily positively, but ethics in the educational system so people know how to think about these issues. It's never an easy answer, but how do you think about it? And then regulation and law. I think you need all 3 to help. None of those is a silver bullet that will solve it. Unions too, yeah. Great.
Well, let's thank James. I know he'll stay around a little bit if people want to chat with him. So thank you.